being recorded.
Just want to quickly run through a couple things before I hand things over to your facilitator, Charles. So we do have most everybody on the audio line today, either through the call-out or the dial-in option. Again, if you do get disconnected at any point today, you can use the dial-out or the callback to reconnect. I also do have the dial-in number and the participant code listed in the technical assistance pod in the upper right corner of your screen for a quick reference if you need to get reconnected for any reason today. We also do recommend just keeping your phone muted today when you're not speaking, so just keep in mind we do have all phone lines open, so it's just a good idea to keep your phone muted when you're not talking just to minimize any background noise. You can use the telephone at the top of your screen if you use the dial-out. Since you're all synced up to use that, you can click on the drop-down arrow there and then mute yourself. You can also use the mute button on your phone if you have one. That works fine as well. Excuse me. The audio information is also listed in the blue eye drop-down in the upper right corner of your screen. As I mentioned, we do have that chat pod available on the right-hand side of your screen today, so if you want to take a moment and type in the name of a movie that you like into that chat pod so you can get familiarized with how that works, you just type your text into the text box at the bottom of the chat and then click on the chat bubble icon to actually send your message through. And again, we did have that poll that is listed at the bottom of the screen there. If you haven't had a chance yet, please go ahead and take a moment to respond to that poll. We will have one other poll that I will bring in today's session, and it will work exactly the same. We'll just click on the circle that corresponds to your answer to vote on that poll. And if you have any questions today, you can use the raise hand icon that is located at the top of your screen. It's the little white guy there raising his hand. If you go ahead and click on that now, you'll see a raise hand will appear next to your name on that participant list on the left side of your screen. There is also a drop-down menu next to that raise hand status there. You'll see there's several other icons there. There's a green check for agree, red X for disagree, and then there's also a icon if you need to step away for any reason during today's session that lets us know that you are stepped away from your desk, so we won't call on you. So just keep that in mind as we go through today's lesson. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, if you have any issues today, you can send a chat message to me by hovering over my name on the attendee list in the upper left and then clicking on Start Private Chat. That will open up a private chat tab in the chat pod on the right-hand side of your screen. So at this point, I will go ahead and introduce your facilitator for today.
And hello, everyone. I'm glad to be meeting you all a little bit more in person. I hope you've had a chance to watch the videos, so you've seen me a little bit, and here you're going to see me again. But this, at least in this context, we'll be able to communicate with each other, and I really hope that you will all participate in this because this is designed to be interactive as opposed to passive like the videos were. Excuse me. I noticed that only a few of you have typed in a name of a movie that you like, and Joshua answered very strongly. Contact listing the greatest movie ever. That was a good movie, although I have to tell you, Joshua, I liked the book a little bit better, but it was a very good movie. So just to familiarize yourself with how the chat works, it's pretty simple. Just if everybody could just type in a movie. And also the poll, Jessica, can we get that poll back? Nice. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2. That's a response I haven't seen. Many of these I've seen before, but not that one. That's a new one. Okay, so and if you haven't, and many of you haven't answered the poll, so please click on one of these buttons here to indicate what amount of experience you had in law school with the practical aspects of contracts, just to give me a sense of what experience level you all have. And Jessica, why don't we go ahead and broadcast the results of that poll. And you can see that 4 of you, this shows percentage and number, 4 of you have had a significant amount. I'm very glad to hear that. 13 of you have had some, 7 of you have had a little, and 2 of you answered, "Are you kidding?" So this is pretty consistent with what I know is typical in the law school community. One of my biggest beefs about law school is how they leave transactional lawyers completely unprepared to do anything of a practical nature, and that's the goal of this program, both the videos and these live sessions, is to try to get you up the learning curve a little bit on how contracts work. So, Jessica, let's get rid of the poll, and let's talk about what we're going to be talking about today. Today, we're going to be focusing on the 3 most common kinds of errors that are made in contract drafting. Now, as a bit of review, before I get to the review, I also need to mention this very important thing, which is a contest that we're going to be having, which is called the Anti-Windbag Contest. And this is designed to highlight a major problem of contract drafting and a major problem in legal writing generally, which is the tendency of lawyers to bloviate. And that's one of my favorite words. If you haven't heard that one before, you should get to know it. Bloviation is what this guy on this slide is doing. It's saying things in a pompous and over-formal and excessively wordy way. So we want to try to avoid bloviation. And this is a little bit tricky because, unfortunately, a lot of the excess verbiage that we see in contracts is there because it's in the precedent. And I'm not advising any of you to start rewriting the precedents that you're asked to use to draft contracts. That's not your job. You can, certainly notice the bloviation in those documents, but I really wouldn't suggest you start to try to improve the style of the precedents that you're asked to use. Eventually, you can start doing that, but at first I wouldn't suggest that. But certainly in your own writing, one of the things you should always be doing is thinking about, can I say this same thing in fewer words? And if the answer to that is yes, that is what you should be doing. So this contest is, every time we see a slide that has this thing, hold on, I got to get I'm supposed to get an arrow here, but my arrow's not working. But this thing on the top, excess verbiage alert, we're going to see slides that have that at the top randomly. And when you see that slide, that tells you in the slide there's a sentence or a phrase that has excess verbiage in it, and try to identify what it is. If you know the answer, if you know what words we need to cut to make the phrase or the sentence better, the way you raise your hand for this purpose is you type the word cut into the chat box and hit enter or hit the little balloon. And that way we'll see who raised their hand first in a way. And we're going to keep doing, this contest is going to continue for today's session and the 2 sessions we're subsequently going to have. And the person with the most cumulative points is going to win a very valuable prize. So in order to get us started on this, I am now going to, and I'm giving you warning here, you're not going to have warning in future cases, but here is the first one. If you can determine what words need to be cut, type the word cut into the chat box. Here we go. Oh, sorry, not this one. This one. What words can we cut here without changing the meaning of this? And if you know the answer, just type the word cut into the chat box. in some cases, the excess verbiage is not, it doesn't create any substantive problems. Other examples we're going to be looking at, the excess verbiage actually can create interpretation issues. Here, it's just unnecessary words, so it doesn't hurt. So if you see a phrase like this in a precedent you're using, I wouldn't go ahead and correct it, but so far I don't see anybody who wants to answer this. I'm sure that somebody out there can, there's no penalty for getting the answer wrong, but a valuable benefit for getting the answer right. And remember, you have to hit, after you type whatever you're typing in, you have to either hit that little bubble, that bubble sign next to the chat box, or hit enter on your keyboard. Okay, so AJ answered something, but all I want you to do is write the word cut. And his point is, an officer of the company is an employee, and I think that's a fair point. Paul, and AJ, we're going to come back to you, but Paul, what would you cut? And you can either chat it, or you can tell us over the phone. Paul, tell us what you think should be cut.
So two things. One is the company and its officer. I've cut the and part because there's already an and at the end. We just put a comma there, and maybe in the bracketed place, instead of the and, maybe you could just put a comma in between those, and we can just cut both of those. That's about, yeah.
Cut. I'm sorry. Say the second thing again.
So it says each an indemnified party and collectively the indemnified parties.
Yes.
Cut the and use a comma instead.
Okay. Well, I'm going to give AJ and Jessica, you can start keeping track of this. I'm going to give AJ a point for saying, yes, officers are employees, so that you don't need the word officers. I'm going to give Paul a point for deleting the first and then Charles Pascal, did you have something else? Because there is something else here. Yeah, Charles also gets a point, so there's a total of 3 points here because there's 3 things that could be cut, but Charles got the one that I was focused on, which is this. There's no need when you define a term to define it in both the plural and in the singular. If we define this universe of people we've described as the indemnified parties, it's abundantly clear without saying it that each of them is an indemnified party. So when you're defining things, no need to define things in the plural and in the singular. So Jessica is going to give a point to AJ, a point to Paul, and a point to Charles in the anti-windbag contest. All right, let's keep going here. So just as a matter of review, among the videos that you looked at earlier, one of the points that I kind of maybe beat to a dead horse is this concept of the importance of precision, why precision is so important, but also why we often can't achieve it. And in the context of talking about that, I talked about when we use terms like reasonableness or materiality, how there's a certain amount of fuzziness in those words and why we use words like that in cases where, in terms of a cost-benefit analysis, we just decide it's worth introducing a little imprecision in order to kind of get this point resolved and move on to the next point. So we use concepts like reasonableness and materiality quite frequently, and when we do that, we recognize that we're we're using a term that there could be, at the margins, there could be some disagreement about how it should be interpreted, and therefore we're not being precise. So that's by way of review. Now, I want to and I'm going to just backtrack a little here, because I just want to tell you the three types of drafting errors we're going to be talking about today: ambiguity, inconsistency, and vagueness. And we're going to start with ambiguity. And ambiguity can be illustrated by this graphic that's on this slide. Take a look at this graphic, and you'll notice that there's there are two cubic shapes in this picture. There's a small cubic shape and there's a larger cubic shape. Raise your hands by clicking on the little hand-raising icon at the top of your screen if you see the smaller cubic shape as being nestled in the corner of the larger cubic shape. Raise your hand if you see the smaller cubic shape as nestled in the corner. And it looks like everybody, almost everybody is raising their hands. Lots of raised hands. Now unraise your hands, and I'm going to ask how many of you see it instead as the smaller cubic shape being an indentation in the larger cubic shape. How many of you see it that way? And it looks like some of you, in fact, many of you see it that way too. This is an illustration of ambiguity. Something is ambiguous if we can see it two completely different ways. And this is a classic optical illusion which does this. But in contract drafting, what we need to be on the lookout for are phrases or sentences or provisions that could be read to mean completely different things by two different readers. So going back to the concept of a Venn diagram on how different readers would interpret something, with terms like reasonableness and materiality, we have the big overlap of the interpretation that we saw in the earlier slide. But with an ambiguous provision, we have a situation where two readers can read it completely differently. And that is something that we always want to avoid. Now, I will tell you that certain lawyers that I've spoken to believe that there is a place for constructive ambiguity in contract drafting. That's a debatable position. I happen to think that's not true. But for your purposes, as a junior lawyer, you should just know that you never want to have something be ambiguous. Okay, so having said that, let's look at some examples of ambiguity. And this first example, there's a couple of ambiguities here, but I'm going to ask you to identify the ambiguity by reference to a poll. We're going to put another poll up, and I'm going to ask you to vote on which of the phrases in this sentence causes an ambiguity. And as soon as a critical mass of you have entered your answers, then we'll see, we'll show you what people answered. And by the way, for all of my examples here, you can always assume that capitalized terms are properly defined in the contract. So here, licensee and licensor are defined, and you can assume they're defined properly and unambiguously. So far, we've got about 15 people having answered, but I see there's many more of you out there, so let's get those numbers up. Okay, we've got about 22 answers. I'm going to ask Jessica to broadcast the results so everybody can see them. And Jessica, just let me know when you've done that. And people can keep voting. Don't let that stop you. Jessica, have you broadcast it?
Yep, those results are now visible, Charles.
Okay, thank you. All right, let's go through these one by one and talk about them. The phrase, shall cause its subsidiaries to deliver, 7 people voted for that one. That's not ambiguous. In fact, that is an extremely common provision in contracts where the party who wants this provision in there wants the other party to do something and wants the other party's subsidiaries to do something, and the only way to get to create that obligation is either have the subsidiary sign the contract or have the party agree to cause its subsidiaries to do whatever the thing is. Now, subsidiaries is not a defined term here. So it may be a little bit vague around the edges, but I think in most cases people would agree on what a subsidiary is. Nobody voted for sales reports. One person voted for litigation reports. And again, sales reports and litigation reports, these terms are not 100% clear. So there could be some room for disagreement as to what these mean. And for that reason, they would probably be a better idea to have them be more fully fleshed out. But they're not really ambiguous. 19 of you correctly identified the ambiguity, which is the phrase requested by the licensor. That phrase is ambiguous. Why? Because it clearly modifies litigation reports. But does it also modify sales reports? Maybe yes, maybe no. Totally unclear. And this is a common problem in cases like this one where you have a list of things, and here it's just a list of 2 things, sales reports and litigation reports. But anytime you have a list and you slap a modifier at either the front of the list or the back of the list, you're going to have an ambiguity because it's not going to be clear whether that modifier modifies the entire list or just the item that it's next to. So not only is requested by the licensor ambiguous, the word quarterly is also ambiguous for the same reason, because the word quarterly modifies sales reports, but it may or may not also modify the term litigation reports. So let's talk about how, once we've identified this ambiguity, we would fix it. And I'm just going to tell you now what the deal is, and the deal that this provision was supposed to create was that the licensee has to deliver 2 things to the licensor. Number 1, quarterly sales reports, and number 2, when requested, litigation reports. Now, the way it was written, it actually says that. It does say that. It does properly reflect the deal. The problem is it also potentially reflects 3 or 4 other possible deals. So how can we rewrite it to make it crystal clear? Well, fixing an ambiguity is usually pretty easy. It's identifying it that's hard, and the reason it's hard to identify is because if you've written it, you like it because it says what you want it to say. But you may not realize it possibly says a bunch of other things. But once we've identified the problem, there's lots of ways to fix it. Here's one way we could fix the problem so that the deal is properly described, and it's just creating 2 different sentences. And back in my college days when I was an English literature major and I considered myself a masterful prose stylist, I would have said this is no good because it's very choppy. And now I could care less about stylistic things like that. What I care about is clarity. And this is clear, so I'm happy with it. Another way of fixing it, if you notice in this example, all I've done is moved some words around in the latter half of the sentence, so it says, deliver to the licensor quarterly sales reports and, comma, if requested by licensor, comma, litigation reports. And by doing that, you basically cause the words quarterly and requested by the licensor to be clearly matched up only to the item that they're supposed to modify. A very common way that people instinctively want to use to fix this kind of problem is to add numeration, which I've done in this slide, put in an A and a B. The problem with this is it doesn't completely solve the problem because it fixes the ambiguity arising from the word quarterly, but the phrase at the end, requested by the licensor, is still potentially modifying both A and B. So merely inserting numeration in this example is not going to fix it. You need to do something more. Okay. I'd like volunteers to identify the ambiguity in this sentence, either, and actually I see a couple of people still have their hands raised, and if you'd unraise your hands, then I can suggest that everybody who has an answer to this, what's the ambiguity here, either raise your hand and then we'll talk on the phone, or just type in your answer to this in the chat box. What's ambiguous here? And William, if your hand is raised because you want to answer this, just tell us what you think the ambiguity is. But if you're not raising your hand, okay, Michael Mattia has identified the problem. It's the word it. The word it is ambiguous in this context because it could be referring back to either the contractor or the owner. And this is a common issue in a common cause of ambiguity where you have a pronoun, like the word it, where the antecedent is not clear. So we need to just replace it with either owner or contractor, depending on which party is supposed to be doing this. And this is the last example of ambiguity. Can somebody tell me what's ambiguous here? Again, either by raising your hand, by clicking on the icon at the top, or by typing something into the chat box. AJ, I think AJ got it right. It's the word stock. What does the word stock mean in this sentence? AJ, what could it mean? What's the ambiguity? What are the two possible interpretations of the word stock here? Or anybody? Yeah, could be securities, or it could be cattle. Here, because of the context, the word rancher, the word itself is ambiguous. Now, these are just three examples out of literally an infinite number of ways that ambiguity can arise. The takeaway here is that you need to get in the habit, and this is true whether you've drafted the contract or whether the contract has been drafted by somebody else, say the lawyer on the other side. Since contract drafting is really a collaborative process, both the drafter and the reviewer are equally responsible for fixing things that don't work. So you need to get in the habit as you're writing or reviewing a contract of having your antennas tuned in to the question, could somebody read this to mean something completely different from what it's intended to mean? And if the answer to that is even maybe, then you need to tighten up the language so that it clearly reflects what the parties have agreed to. Okay, now let's talk about the second problem area, which is vagueness. Vagueness, unlike ambiguity, is not an absolute no-no. And we've already seen that, right? Because terms like reasonableness and materiality and in the ordinary course of business and promptly, terms and phrases like that are vague. They have some looseness of interpretation around the edges. And as I've said now many times, we choose to use those terms when we do because it's really not worth it to try to get to a more precise point. So that's not what I'm talking about when I talk about vagueness in this context. I'm talking now about sentences or provisions in contracts that are so vague that they really don't mean anything. That we can't, if our client calls us up and asks us, counselor, tell me what this sentence requires me to do, or tell me what this sentence says, if we can't give them a pretty good answer, then that sentence is too vague. Because it does, it's not clear. It's not enforceable as a contract provision because it's not clear what it means. That's too vague. So let's look at some examples of sentences that are afflicted with this level of vagueness. And again, I'm looking for a volunteer. I'd like somebody, whoever responds first, I'm going to actually want to talk to you on the phone. So don't be shy, but I'd like to have a conversation with somebody on this. So please, somebody either raise your hand or you can type in your response as to what is excessively vague here, but then I'm going to want to chat with you about it. Charles Pascal has raised his hand. Charles, what do you think why is this sentence too vague?
I think the word adequate is unclear.
Absolutely. The word adequate is not adequate here. What does adequate mean? There's no way of determining what adequate means in this context. Once again, if your client calls you up and says, we're renewing our insurance policies and we want to know what this requires us to do, you're going to have no basis for giving them any advice. So it's way too vague. So Charles, what if instead this sentence was written this way? Seller shall maintain insurance on the subject assets that seller considers to be adequate. Putting aside the question of whether a buyer on the other side of this deal would ever agree to that, putting that issue aside, is this sentence now still too vague? Charles, what do you think? If your client calls you up and says, what do we have to do here? Your client is the seller. What do you tell them?
Well, I think it's clearer, but it's still, I would say that's much better.
It's totally clear, basically, because it says, what's the mechanism for determining what's adequate? Easy. You ask the seller. There's a mechanism for determining what's adequate. Now, it's a lousy mechanism if you're the buyer, and you're never going to agree to this. But from the standpoint of vagueness, it works really well. Now, here's another way this provision could be expressed. Companies shall maintain insurance in amounts and against such risks as is consistent with customary standards in the company's industry. Is this vague? Yes, it's vague. Because different people could have different interpretations of what these customary industry standards are in this particular industry. But is it too vague? And really the litmus test for this is if you were fighting about this in a litigation as to what this means, could the trier of fact determine what are customary standards in the company's industry, and does the company's insurance, is the company's insurance consistent with that? And the answer to that question is yes. The trier of fact could determine what's customary in the industry. How would they do that? Expert testimony, etc. So this is an example of the kind of vagueness where we know it's vague, but this is what we agreed to because making it more precise isn't worth the trouble. If any of you have ever worked on a project financing, and you haven't been around that long, so I don't know if any of you have, feels like project financings or construction loans, in deals like that, insurance is so important. The insurance aspects of the deal are so important. They wouldn't use this kind of vague language. I've seen project finance deals where there's 2 or 3 pages worth of insurance requirements. Every detail of every kind of insurance policy is spelled out because it's a key element of the deal. In other transactions where it's not as important, people will agree on language like this just to get it done and move on to the next point. So here's the second example, and I'm looking at again for a volunteer, but you can chat. We don't need to talk about this, but you can either raise your hand or chat. What's wrong with this sentence? Why is this sentence too vague? And it deals with the material adverse change clause, which is something that I talked about in one of the videos. It's a very common concept in acquisition agreements, but it doesn't work here. Why not? Brendan says it doesn't reference to what or who the MAC applies. Exactly. Material adverse change to what? Now, if the material adverse change had initial caps here, then it would be a defined term, and we go and we look in the definitions, and hopefully there'd be a good definition. But it's not defined. So material adverse change to what? It doesn't say. Could be a material adverse change in the weather. Now, again, going back to something I mentioned in the videos, the parole evidence rule says that unless a provision is unclear or is ambiguous on its face, if the parties are litigating as to what the provision means, it's going to be interpreted strictly in accordance with its terms without regard to what the parties intended. So in most cases, the intent of the parties is irrelevant. But here, since it's unclear, and in fact all these examples I've been giving so far, since they're unclear and there was a litigation, the parties would be able to bring in evidence as to what they intended, and that would be a question of fact as well. But that's somewhere where we never want to get to as deal lawyers. Our goal, as much as possible, is to keep the interpretation of the contract out of any litigator's hands in the future. Okay, remember, if you think you know what needs to be cut here, write the word cut into the chat box. That's all you have to do, and then I'll call on you and you'll tell us what needs to be cut. Charles, talk to us. Charles was on the board first, so Charles, what would you cut here? You would cut hereby. Lessee agrees that it shall not perform. Okay, I'm going to give Charles points for that. Terms like hereby, hereunder, thereunder, all those kinds of phrases sometimes actually are useful. Here, it's unnecessary. But I'm also going to look at people who wrote cut because there's more that can be cut here. So I'm going to give Charles a point, but anybody else who wrote cut, I'm going to give them a chance. Michael, Mattia, what else would you cut out other than hereby, if you have anything?
I would say, except as described on Schedule N, Leslie shall not perform any renovations to the premises.
So what you're doing, two things. Number one, you're moving the except as clause to the beginning. But more importantly, what are you taking out here? By doing what you just did, in addition to moving things around, what have you deleted?
Agrees.
Yeah. So it's not just the hereby, it's also the agrees. So I'm going to give each of Charles and Michael a point there. This is one of my pet peeves. And it's not a big deal. And you're going to see this all the time in the contracts that you read and the precedents that you use. But this sentence is contained in a contract. And by definition, a contract is something that the parties who are party to the contract are agreeing to in its entirety. That's what a contract is. So why on earth would you ever have one sentence in the contract saying that one party hereby agrees to this specific thing? Does that suggest they're not agreeing to everything else in the contract? But of course that's not true. They are agreeing to everything else. So it's completely superfluous. Notwithstanding that, you're going to see it all the time. Okay. This last example of vagueness, this sentence is vague because it's missing a number of necessary things. There are big gaping holes in this sentence which create a substantive problem. We don't know there's not enough here to have this sentence be enforceable as a contract provision. There's huge gaping holes. What's missing here? There's at least 3 major gaping holes and a couple of minor holes. And whoever writes cut can tell me what things they see that are missing here. And if you've got more than one, you can give me more than one. AJ.
It's important who's drafting the legal opinion, which parties chooses counsel. That's pretty important.
Okay, so what counsel is going to be giving the legal opinion? So AJ gets a point, but we still got more here, folks. Okay, I think Holly was put in cut from the last one. So what else can be cut here? Just all you have to do is type the word cut. And then okay, Charles, what do you got? Delivered to who? Correct. It says the opinion shall be delivered. Well, if there's a delivery, it's got to be a delivery to somebody. It doesn't say who. It says any investor can request it, but it doesn't say who gets it. So that's one for Charles. There's still a couple of major things here that are missing. Holly. I think it's Holly. It says Holly Hawk, but I assume that's Holly. What else is missing? How is it to be requested? Okay, that's what I would call one of the minor holes. How is a request given? And the answer to that sometimes is answered in the miscellaneous clauses at the end of the contract. It may say that all requested notices have to be given a certain way. But if it's not covered there, we would definitely want to put it in here, some details on how the request is made. So we're going to give Holly a point there, Jessica. And Charles has another one. When? Charles said that's a huge gaping hole. When does it have to be delivered? Even if you fix all the other holes, without a when, the obligation never actually is enforceable. So when? So Charles gets another point. There's still one big one, maybe the biggest one. is missing. What's missing here? In order to have an enforceable obligation. Holly. How is it to be delivered? Okay, that's another one. So Holly's going to get another point. That's not the big one I was going for, but it is a gap. How, is it delivered? Can it be delivered by email? Does it have to be delivered by hand? So that's a question. Paul, what's the one big thing that's still a legal opinion isn't defined? Well, that's true, but it says a legal opinion in the matter set forth in Exhibit A. I think that's going to be clear enough. So Valeria, what do you have, Valeria? Or Valeria? I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. To whom? Well, that was already that question was already asked, or that point was already made. To whom is it delivered? That was one of the first ones. Joshua, go ahead, Joshua. The Guatemalan sinkhole of gaping holes. Wow. Exhibit A to what agreement? Okay, let's talk about that. This is not it, by the way, so I'm still looking for an answer here. When an exhibitor schedule is referred to in a contract without anything further, it always means an exhibitor schedule to this contract. Alex Cowan, what do you got? When you guys see it, I want to hear Alex's response. When you guys hear this, you're going to be dumbfounded that you didn't see this. Who will pay the attorney's fees? Nah. Holly, you had another one? I mean, that's who is, but yeah. Delivered, Holly gets it. She gets another point. This is huge. Delivered by who? This sentence purports to create a contract obligation, an obligation to deliver something, but it doesn't say whose obligation it is. It's written in the passive voice. It doesn't say. It just says the opinion shall be delivered. Here's the takeaway, folks. In a contract provision that purports to create any kind of obligation, whether it's a payment obligation, performance obligation, delivery obligation, you need to be thinking like a journalist. And the questions that journalists are trained to think about are who, what, when, where, often, and how. And in this case, there's another one, which is not only who's doing it, but who is it being done to, or who's it being delivered to. So you need all that stuff in order to create an enforceable obligation. Okay, let's move on to inconsistency. Contracts are like machines. Every part needs to work with every other part. So part of the challenges of revising a contract is you change something in one place, it may require a change somewhere else. Things have to work consistently. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through a hypothetical involving an inconsistency that creates a substantive problem. So this example I'm about to give you involves a lease of a home, residential real estate lease. The tenant looks out her window one day and is horrified to see the power company there with cherry pickers and trucks stringing huge power lines across her yard. So she calls the landlord up. Well, no, before she calls the landlord up, she pulls out her lease and looks at the lease and sees this provision. I'm sorry, I'm taking this out of order. Forgive me. She does call the landlord up first before she looks at the lease, and she calls up the landlord and says, hey, you should know they're doing this. And the landlord says, well, I know about this because I granted Con Ed an easement to run those power lines. Then she pulls out her lease, she flips around, and she finds this provision here, which is, it's not labeled as such, but it's a representation and warranty because it's a statement of fact. So she points the landlord to it and she says, landlord, you said there were no easements. And the landlord's response to that is, well, when we signed the lease 6 months ago, there were no easements. I granted this easement to Con Ed a week ago. So the tenant thinks a little bit, and she remembers when she saw the first draft of this lease, she remembered looking at this provision and realizing that it didn't really protect her going forward against all the horrible things that are listed here. And she doesn't even really understand what all these things are, but you can tell they're bad. So she was smart enough to figure out the basic difference or the basic mechanism of reps and warranties, which is they're just a statement of fact made as of a moment in time. They don't have continuing force unless they're brought down again in the future, which this one isn't. So she remembers seeing that. She remembers calling up her lawyer and saying, hey, make sure I'm protected against all of this stuff in the future. So she flips around in the lease and she finds this provision. And she says to the landlord, look, landlord, you promised not to do it. And now I'm putting both provisions up on the screen here. What's the landlord's response when she says, you promised not to do it? If you're representing the landlord, right, Michael has identified the issue. The landlord's going to say, I'm not sure I know what you're talking about. I don't see the word easement in there anywhere in that second provision, which, by the way, is a covenant. The word easement doesn't appear. So the tenant at that point covers up her phone, curses at her lawyer, gets back on the phone with the landlord and says, well, I kind of see your argument, but, I believe that the word encumbrance is very broad in its scope and therefore would include easements by its terms. And of course the landlord's response to that is going to be, no. If we had intended the word encumbrance to include easements, why would we have specified easements in the first provision and not in the second one? Clearly, we intended these two provisions to have different coverage. Now, was there a meeting of the mind between the landlord and the tenant on this issue? No, it was never discussed. Here's how this inconsistency arose. Remember, the tenant had asked her lawyer to make sure she was protected going forward against this list of horribles. And so that night, her lawyer was drafting up a rider to the lease, drafting a covenant to do that, and he was literally copying the words from the rep, and his phone rang in the middle of him doing that, and he got distracted and made a mistake. Now I'm noticing Michael wrote, but date hereof equals today, and that's continuous. No, this is a rep and warranty, and the phrase on the date hereof, when you see that in a contract, what that means is it's on the date that the contract is entered into or the date that the contract is effective. And it's done in reps and warranties just to make it absolutely clear that the reps and warranties are statements of fact only as of that one point in time. So the landlord wins this argument because of this inconsistency. Even though the parties never agreed on this, and it was certainly not the tenant's intent to permit easements, but she loses because the parole evidence rule tells us, since these provisions are clear, there's no relevance to what the party's intent was. let's look at, before I go on, if I were that lawyer representing the tenant, what I would have done is this. I would have used defined term. I would have defined the whole universe of things that's described in the rep as encumbrances, or I could have called it anything. I could have called it applesauce, although it's a good practice to come up with names for defined terms which give the reader some sense of what they're all about. So I probably define these all things as encumbrances. And then in the covenant, I just have to restrict the creation or existence of capital E encumbrances. One of the main reasons we use definitions is to make sure that a concept means exactly the same thing every time it's used. If you use defined terms, there's no way you can have this kind of problem that we're looking at here arise. All right, I've got one additional example of inconsistency. I'm going to skip this one. Before I get to that, remember, all you need to do is type the word cut in at first. Don't forget, a valuable prize awaits at the end of the third session. This one is kind of a small one. Okay, Matthew, tell us what you found. What do we cut?
Each and? I would
Yeah.
cut out.
Each and or and every. I would cross out and every, but I think either way works. But each and every. So Matthew is going to get a point. Each and every. This is one of the phrases, and there's lots of them. Each and every, due and payable. There's just lots of times where lawyers like to say things 2 or 3 different ways, and it's almost always unnecessary. You'll see sometimes the seller hereby sells, transfers, assigns, alienates, and I can't even think of what all the synonyms are. So just try not to do that. Again, you're going to see this kind of language all the time. And generally, it's not worth making a fuss over. It's just when you're actually writing something, try to train yourself not to do it. Okay. This is the last example of inconsistency. These are 2 provisions in an acquisition agreement relating to the payment of the purchase price. And as in many acquisition agreements, the buyer has to pay the purchase price at closing, which is what the first sentence deals with. But then there's potentially something called a purchase price adjustment, where the buyer has to pay an additional amount in the future. And that's what the second sentence here is about. And there's an inconsistency between these 2 sentences that could cause a problem for the seller, a substantive problem. This isn't just style, this is substance. So can anybody, and this isn't as easy as the one I just went through. The one I just went through is just proofreading, just seeing that the word easement is missing. This is a little bit trickier, but can anybody tell me why these, in what way are these 2 provisions inconsistent? Holly says closing date. One is defined, one is not. Okay, well, closing date is not a defined term in the first sentence. In the second sentence, closing date balance sheet is a defined term, and probably closing date should be defined too, but that's not what I'm looking for here. Anybody else? What's the inconsistency? Okay. I'm going to let you off the hook and tap. Oh, somebody's typing. I'm going to give Brendan a chance. I see that he's busy typing. Well, I'm just going to go ahead and it's the phrase immediately available funds that appears in the first one and not the second one. What do we mean by immediately available funds? Well, immediately available funds means a form of payment where the recipient can actually spend it right away. So here's the scenario where the seller could be harmed by this inconsistency. Let's say it's a Friday before a 3-day weekend, and the purchase price adjustment that the buyer is required to pay is due on this Friday. And a representative of the buyer shows up at the seller's doorstep at 4 o'clock in the afternoon with a check for the $20 million payment that they're required to make on that date. And the seller will then call its lawyer and say, they just showed up with a check. Do I have to accept this? And the answer is going to be yes, because the second sentence didn't specify immediately available funds. Immediately available funds means either cash, which is never how we pay for things in Big Deal, or an electronic transfer, where the money will almost either immediately or almost immediately show up in the recipient's account. Getting this uncertified check at 4 o'clock on Friday before a 3-day weekend, the seller isn't even going to be able to deposit it until Tuesday, and then it's going to take several days to clear. It's going to lose maybe 6 days or 7 days of interest on $20 million. That is the kind of thing that clients tend to care about. Okay, so that's it for today. I thank you all for being here. We got a really good attendance today. We're meeting again next Wednesday, March 4th, at the same time, 2 o'clock Eastern Time. We're going to be talking about attention to detail in contract drafting. And then at the end of the session on Wednesday, I'm going to be sending out a contract or segments of a contract that need lots of fixing up. And I'm going to ask you to review it and be ready to talk about the mistakes in it and what needs to be done to it by the third session. And I don't remember the third session off the top of my head, but I think it's pretty much 2 weeks from now. So you'll be getting that assignment, if you will, from me at the end of next week's session. So for now, we are done. You can sign off now if you like. If you have any questions at all, you can either ask them on the phone, you can type them into the chat box, in which case everybody will see them, or you can type them into this Q&A box that appears on your screen now, which means only I will see the questions, and then I will repeat the questions and answer them for the whole group. So anybody with any questions at all, including any questions on things that you might have had relating to the videos, please feel free to answer. Otherwise, please feel free to sign off, get back to work, get a cup of coffee, whatever it is you're going to do, and I hope to see you again next Wednesday. So I'll just hang out here to see if anybody has any questions.